Good morning and welcome to the webinar, The Rise of Renewable Energy in the ICT Sector. We're still waiting for some of the participants to join us, so please stay put. The presentation will start in the next few minutes. Once again, welcome to the webinar, The Rise of Renewable Energy in the ICT Sector. My name is Fatu Samate, and I'm a product manager at South Pole Group. I will be guiding you through today's presentation. During the last few months, we've seen that the topic of renewable energy has really risen to the top of the agenda for many leading ICT companies. And we're happy to provide some guidance on how you can take leadership and be part of the movement. Today's speakers are Junio Valerio Palomba, Senior Key Account Manager for Sustainable ICT, and Natalia Gurina, Sales Director for Carbon and Renewables. Junio is an experienced key account manager with a special focus on the ICT industry. And Natalia has years of experience of supplying large corporations in various industries with renewable energy certificates. We'd also like you to get involved during the course of the webinar by asking questions. You can do this by posting your questions in the question panel. A selection of these questions will then be answered in the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. We will also conduct anonymous polls throughout the webinar, where we would ask you to answer a few questions on the topic of renewable energy. I just want to make clear that participation in these polls are voluntary, but we do encourage you to join us. For those of you who are active on social media, we'd like you to follow the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtags Ready4 2020, Green ICT, and tagging South Pole Group. So the agenda for today is the following. We'll start by providing an overview of South Pole Group. Next, we'll dive into the topic of renewable energy in the ICT industry and what the latest market trends are. Then we will look at renewable energy procurement, specifically comparing different renewable energy solutions available on the market. In the following section, we'll take a deeper dive into one of these solutions, namely renewable energy certificates. We'll also give you some insight into how we can help you take the next steps in sourcing renewable energy. And finally, we'll end with a Q&A session where Junio and Natalia will be ready to answer to your most burning questions. And now I'll hand over to Junio, who will give us a short overview of who we are and how we help companies create value from sustainability-related activities.
Thank you, Fatou. Good morning to the audience and welcome to our webinar. During the course of the next hour, my colleague Natalia and myself will discuss with your important contributions the increasing importance of renewable energy in the ICT industry. Specifically, we will focus on the opportunities that can be harvested through careful planning and strategic sources of the right renewable energy instruments. What's important to keep in mind from your perspective as an audience is that this transition, it's not a sprint, but rather a marathon. And the sooner companies start training for it and realize that it's not only inevitable, but beneficial to their businesses, the better they can design their energy sourcing strategies going forward. Who are we, and most importantly, what are our credentials in these sectors? The South Pole Group is a global sustainability firm with a strong on-the-ground presence that stretches all the way from the Silicon Valley to Siberaya in Malaysia. Regardless of where you're following us from today, we are most likely to be within reach of your offices or facilities. This gives us an incredible capacity to both understand local challenges and implement global solutions aimed at reducing your carbon emissions no matter where they're taking place. What you see here are just some of the benefits that our global pipeline of actions has allowed us to achieve so far. And the emphasis here very much goes on the so far part of the sentence, as we keep growing and expanding our business to include new solutions and growth our expertise into new sectors. We're a climate action specialist with a 10 years history of resilience, growth, and diversification. And after having established ourselves as a leader in the development of emission reduction projects, we have used our success to pivot our way into other areas of sustainability, such as renewable energies and sustainability advisory, always with a focus on climate change and sustainable solutions for the long term. We have the pleasure and the honor of working with some of the largest and most sustainable companies in the world across a number of sectors and industries to help them achieve their targets and implement new visionary ways to reduce their climate impact. Now, as you can see from this slide, ICT is a sector that has some of our most interesting clients indeed. SAP and Microsoft are just two of the most prominent examples of how we are supporting leaders in this industry in their transition to renewable energy. But let's take a closer look at our audience for today. And between today's sessions and yesterday's session, we have had approximately 70 guests registered with a very heterogeneous background. Now, the majority of you, or rather say, are coming from the IT services and telecom industry. This includes also a number of data center companies. The electronic equipment sector is also very strongly represented, and we have a very interesting mix of players from the others category. These contain very diverse actors, including international media outlets, investment banks, NGOs, and consultancy firms. And we already saw it yesterday during the polls, but we were confident that it will make for some very interesting contributions during the Q&A session. Now, let's dive right into today's topic by framing it in the bigger picture of the Paris Agreement. What is the Paris Agreement? Well, simply put, it's an historic moment for climate change and diplomacy, as it constitutes the single most important piece of legislation in the making concerning emission reductions and reduction of greenhouse gases on a global scale. Now, there's three things that are important to keep in mind while looking at this slide. First of all, you ought to keep in mind that national governments will trickle down these targets on corporates. It is their signature, it is your MPs or, it's your PMs or president's signature on the agreement, but it will likely be your responsibility to implement strategies that will keep the temperature below the agreed target. Second of all, the agreement is specifically designed to encourage corporates to act on two fronts, specifically by reducing greenhouse gas emissions at home and finance emission reduction projects abroad, specifically in emerging countries, because that's where most of the potentials for emission reductions is. Thirdly, if you were on holiday during the Paris Agreement, like most of our clients, and luckily for you with your head stuck in the sand somewhere, our CEO was kind enough to put together a very good presentation, a very succinct presentation, which is already available on our LinkedIn profile and will soon be available also on our YouTube channel. Now, this slide, the following one, it's actually a slide that I borrowed from his own presentation, and it actually pictures quite well the essence of the Paris Agreement, and most importantly, our role as a global sustainability advisor. Now, the diplomatic agreement of Paris has provided an excellent economic playground for corporates to achieve emission reductions in a variety of ways, but it's now up to the corporates themselves, as well as their advisors, the thick nexus of internal and external stakeholders, to make sure that this sustainability theme park is more successful than Euro Disney, we could say. How important is the involvement of how important is the corporate involvement for the success of renewable energies worldwide and also for the Paris Agreement? Well, it's nothing short of fundamental, really, because the question has shifted dramatically during the past 3-4 years from the question is shifted from if the world will transition to cleaner energy, but rather how long it will take. That is the question. And no matter what report you look at, whether if it's a specific ICT industry report or a global energy outlook, the question is very much incumbent and deemed necessary and incoming, rather than a simple possibility. Now, this chart from Bloomberg New Energy Finance is actually really interesting because it forecasts the billions of dollars that are needed to be invested each year in order to avoid the most severe consequences of climate change. And we can see around the financial crisis, at the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008, how the red line represented the actual investment in renewable energy, and the blue line, which was the targeted investment necessary to stay within the 2 degrees limit, has actually grown farther and farther apart. And the actual good news comes from the ICT sector, because without a doubt it has been well above average in terms of positive contribution to the pursuit of cleaner energy. Now, this data from the Green Power Partnership Initiative in the US demonstrates that tech and telecom corporates dwarf any other industry in terms of renewable energy usage. And there are certainly some interesting key drivers behind this performance. Number one, the fact that it's a deeply intrinsic energy intensity industry. And I guess the whole thing that you all have in common with today's participants, yesterday's participants, is the fact that whether you're a data center operator or a semiconductor producer, electricity is the common denominator of your businesses. And second of all, it's also likely to be the most important item in your energy bill, in your bills, and very likely to impact also your bottom line and your P&L statements. What what is also interesting to reflect upon is that for industry leaders within the ICT sector, and more as an overall trend, energy has become so material and in fact so vital that is no longer treated as simply a sourcing exercise, but is very much an integral part of their operations. And energy security and greenhouse gas reductions now go very much hand in hand, often at the top of the management agenda, as they're very much two sides of the same coin. So the question today is straightforward. The question is, if you like, if you want to phrase it in an accounting way, is how can you increase a fundamental asset like energy without also increase the attached liability of carbon emissions? And the answer to the question is simple, and is by switching more and more to renewable energies. Now, reporting is, of course, another important driver of corporate green strategies. Companies want to be environmentally friendly, they want to be recognized by it, they want customers and shareholders and sometimes also competitors to know about it. The last 3-4 years have really seen a boom in a mushrooming, really, of reporting tools and fora. We have summarized here some of the most prominent ones, and it's also interesting to see that once again the ICT sector is leading both in the number of participants as well as in the performances that are being recorded. We talked earlier about leading by example and how for the largest ICT corporates, energy has become more than a utility, but rather a necessity. Now, what I found very interesting about this slide and about green credentials in the ICT sector is that there is a very strong positive correlation between renewable energy usage, market cap, and market leadership, as well as reputation. If you look at these highlights, we have 3 very different companies, 3 drastically diverse business models that might intersect from time to time on competitions like mobile phones or mobile data applications, but nonetheless 3 very diverse business models and core businesses. But there's one common target. There's one thing that puts Microsoft, Google, and Apple in the same basket, and that is the idea and the target to reach 100% renewable energy sourcing through increased investments, increased and diversified investments, I rather say. Now, 2 more things for you to think about. The first one is that this is not a common trend with other industries, not at all. When you think about it in other sectors like retailing or power utilities, bigger and better do not necessarily equate with green. It's actually the exception rather than the rule. For instance, if you think of someone like Walmart in the retailing industry, or RWE in the energy space, they're neither praised nor famous for their green credentials, actually quite the opposite. Second, when you look closely into the snapshot about Apple and its renewable energy commitments, you will notice how the trend for clean energy sourcing, it's global. It's not limited to Cupertino or California alone. And as Apple and other ICT companies expand into other markets, they want to make sure that their sourcing strategy and energy strategies are aligned, in this case, from California to Singapore. Now, there's an important element to underline here, is the fact that whereas on the one hand, California and most of the US have an energy regulated market, and it's relatively easy for a company like Apple to switch to renewable energy. On the other hand, sourcing renewable energy in large volumes from emerging markets like Singapore or China or India or Brazil, it is not so straightforward, at least at first sight. Well, this was also this was the same challenge pretty much that SAP approached us with 2 years ago, and it was actually the task of sourcing several thousand megawatt hour of renewable energy for their facilities in Taiwan, Turkey, and China. And this is where our on-the-ground experience and capacity to generate, source, and procure RECs for these countries was fundamental. And thanks to this expertise and capillarity, we have successfully helped Marcus and his team to achieve the renewable their RE100 target. Now, unfortunately, Marcus and his team could not be with us today, but SAP represents still a very excellent reference and case study for the kind of holistic turnkey solutions that we can provide to ICT companies. Speaking of case studies, you will find the SAP white paper in the list of attachments available for your perusal. Well, it's time for me to get an espresso and for Fatou to circulate the first poll. Fatou, back to you.
Thank you, Junio, for this insight into the growing importance of sourcing renewable energy in the ICT industry. It is indeed time for our first poll. So I would like you all to answer the questions that will appear as pop-up windows on your screen. I will go ahead and start with the first question, which is, do you have a renewable energy commitment? Please take some time to answer the question. Thank you. The next question is, when is the deadline of your commitment? Thank you for that. Third question is, have you joined any of the following initiatives? And here multiple answers are possible. Thank you once again. And the final question in this section is, what are the key drivers behind your renewable energy commitment? And here you can select up to 3 options. Interestingly, an overwhelming majority here selected voluntary initiatives, 43%. That's quite an interesting, significant figure compared to peer pressure and pressure from shareholders that ended up at 29%. Junio, what do you have to say to that, to those figures?
Well, I think it's an interesting element, and it certainly goes back to the slide that we showed before about how much the ICT sector, but there's 2 elements of it. The first of all is that, as we can see, there has been a proliferation of reporting activities and tools, and the ICT industries and the ICT companies are want to take a very strong lead in that. They're serious about these commitments. They want to demonstrate to their customers that they're up for it, and they're putting in place the necessary tools. The second one is that it is an industry trend. We can see that from the results of the poll, and I think it also stands as a test compared to other industries that the ICT sector sees this as a necessity, really, rather than something that has to be imposed by legislation, but what we have defined here as mandatory commitments, properly, because the people that are dialing today and some of the some of the companies' management themselves realize the amount of opportunities, especially for energy savings, that could be achieved with this initiative. So it's in their best interest to make sure that these are initiatives that they take part and implement.
Thank you for that, Junio. We have experienced some technical difficulties here with the slides, but I think we're on the right track again. The next topic is renewable energy procurement, and Junio will give us an overview of the different renewable energy solutions that are currently available on the market.
Thanks, Fatu. And once again, thanks for the audience for your contribution. Your answers are very important and useful for us also to track the development of the market, as well as understand firsthand what is your impact and understanding of the industry and the challenges. Now, there is, I particularly like the BT case study, the British Telecom case study, and I would like to take a closer look at it because, in my opinion, it contains all the elements of challenge and opportunity that are embedded in a renewable energy sourcing strategy. Now, as in the case of Apple, switching to renewable energy for BT in its own country, the United Kingdom, was relatively straightforward for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, it's a very well-regulated energy market, and there are a plurality of green energy programs that can and offerings that are available for corporates. In the case of BT and their electricity provider and power, they could deal with that. They could deal on a one-to-one basis, and they were actually able to negotiate probably a very favorable tariff given the very significant demand that BT has in the UK, where it's one of the largest consumers of electricity. And thanks to this one-on-one relationship, they were able to switch to renewable energies for their entire UK operations almost overnight, or however in a very short period of time. Now, the story is completely different in markets where BT is not one of the major buyers, and where green electricity programs are simply not provided by the power utilities, or if they are available, they're very difficult to negotiate. And this is a very important part of our value proposition, and it's something that my colleague Natalia will explain in depth in a few slides. Now, this page actually provides an excellent overview of the strategy that corporates like yourselves can apply. You can consider them ranked in both in increasing order of easiness to deploy, as well as for the value that they add, both to the companies themselves and to the grid in terms of additional green capacity. First option is a so-called unbundled purchase, whereby a company will approach a third-party vendor like Salpo Group to buy only the renewable energy certificates. The second case is very much the case of BT's transaction with npower in the UK, in a so-called bundle purchase where the buyer will acquire both the energy and the green certificate, most likely from a power utility. Now, at this point of the conversation, it's important to draw a very thick red imaginary line between the first two, direct procurement and green tariff, and between the following tools: power purchase agreements or PPAs, and direct project investment. REC products, so option number one and option number two, represent an important third step for all corporates planning to decrease their greenhouse gas emissions. Why, you ask? Because they imply very low risks in terms of capital, counterparty, and currency. Most transactions between these two available sourcing options, number one and number two, are spot, which pretty much take care of all the aforementioned risk right away. So capital upfront is quite limited. Counterparty are mostly regulated or very well established, and they often take place in your own currency. So that there's no kind of risk of this kind. Yes, prices may vary depending on quantity and the type of project, but they do not require significant long-term investments. On the contrary, when we look at instruments like power purchase agreements and direct project investments, they require significant upfront capital, and they possess a higher risk level, first of all because of the number of parties involved in these transactions, and as well as the length of such agreements, which is normally between 10 to 20 years, sometimes even longer. When we talk about the challenges of sourcing renewable energies, we have to keep in mind two things. The first one is that when it comes to defining and implementing a strategy, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution. Our experience has taught us that over and over during the years. Corporates have different priorities. All of our clients have different budgets, timeframes, and risk appetites. And thanks to this experience and our commercial flexibility, our portfolio of solutions can accommodate all of them. Secondly, these instruments are often used in combination with each other. They are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they are extremely complementary, especially in terms of geography. For instance, a company might decide to go for a long-term PPA deal in a regulated market in their own country, for instance, with a low counterparty risk because they're familiar with the legislations and the counterparty, and there's fewer currency risks. But it might decide to go for a spot REX deal for its facilities in China or in other emerging markets where the perceived risk, especially by the legal department, can be higher. In general, what we envision and suggest as an advisor is a step-by-step strategy where RECs are used as a stepping stone into more long-term, more added value solutions. Now, for instance, we're working on a number of RECs plus PPA deals in Asia, once again leveraging on our strong local presence and market awareness. Now, I find particularly interesting, and the company is interested more and more in pursuing virtual PPAs. We have the capacity to provide advisory in that sector, and they're a very interesting and recent market development, but one which we think opens the door to many interesting opportunities. Now, this last slide is an excellent summary of the options that we have described so far, and it provides also multiple layers of analysis in terms of risks versus rewards of the different products and solutions. So you have summarized here some of the products that we've already mentioned: normal RECs, green power purchase agreements, and direct investment. It is also an excellent segue into Natalia's presentation, which will focus closely on the very first row, which is the high quality RECs, and it's also a core value proposition. But before we hear from Natalia, we will pause once again to ask for your important feedback.
Thank you, Junio. It is time for yet another poll. I would also like to remind you that the polls are voluntary. However, your input is highly appreciated. We will summarize the results of these polls into an article that we will share with you within the next few days. So please participate in these polls. So the next poll is: which kind of renewable energy solution or solutions are you currently pursuing? And here multiple answers are possible. Thank you all very much for providing your answers. And this actually provides a great transition into the next section, which is about the first option there that you had, renewable energy certificates. I'd like to welcome Natalia to give us an overview of RECs.
Thank you, Fatou, for the introduction. I'm going to jump directly into the topic of renewable energy certificates. So as Junio has introduced earlier, renewable energy certificates are purchased in an unbundled way compared to the underlying electricity. In other words, your company, which needs electricity to running its operations, can purchase electricity from its utility or another electricity provider, and you would not know from which source that electricity will come from. And if you would like to actually demonstrate that you are purchasing renewable energy, electricity coming from renewable energy sources, then you would need to also purchase renewable energy certificates from the same utility or from another provider. Renewable energy certificates are denominated in megawatt hours, so 1 megawatt hour is equal to 1 REC, and they're typically held in registry systems. In other words, electronic tracking systems, where these certificates are issued, can be transferred, and most importantly, retired. In other words, they are cancelled forever, so that that's the only way to demonstrate that amount of renewable energy certificates has been used to match a certain fossil fuel derived electricity consumption. So why would you actually purchase RECs? Well, there are several drivers for that from the corporate world. Obviously, if the company has a renewable energy target, which could be a portion of its total electricity consumption or 100%, like in the case of the RE100 initiative, then RECs are actually a valuable way and a quite quick, effective, and low-cost way to reach such a target. Secondly, if your company is also reporting its emissions, its greenhouse gas emissions, so calculating the carbon footprint and reporting it in an annual report or with a submission to the CDP, or the organization which is just before called the Carbon Disclosure Project, then actually from January 2015, there is a new guidance released by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the entity that governs the rules for the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. And this guidance actually specifies quite in detail what constitutes a renewable energy purchase, how do you report it in terms of emissions, and includes also a number of criteria that the renewable energy certificates must meet in order to be reportable as zero emissions. And this is the interesting thing, that basically you can, by purchasing RECs matching your electricity and heat consumption, you can in fact reduce your scope 2 emissions. And the scope 2 emissions are the emissions derived from electricity consumption. And finally, if you have buildings which you would like to switch to or to obtain a label, a certification of a high level of sustainability, then the LEED certification is the most used in this field. And here also purchasing RECs will allow you to obtain higher points and therefore obtain the LEED certification more easily. Now, what is our RECs offering? In other words, what sort of renewable energy certificate products does South Pole Group offer? Well, actually, we span the entire range of available renewable energy certificates products out there worldwide. And here I've made a list of this, so they can be grouped as international REC products. These are the IREC, International REC Standard, and Gold Power. Then regional REC products, those that cover North America and Europe, and then national level schemes like Australia, Japan, South Africa, Brazil, and India. Actually, the picture is evolving very quickly. There are more and more types of national RECs being developed, as well as quite a lot of changes in in the regional and international schemes. So I will go a little bit more in detail on some of these products. So the International REC standard, it's a standard which was launched at the end of 2014. It basically mimics the functioning of the more established North American and European system. And it has been established in order to fill the gaps, so basically for countries where such existing national REC systems do not exist yet. And currently there are a number of Asian countries where the international REC products are available, and Southport Group is actually developing, so basically registering power plants in developing countries under this standard, and we have IRECs then to offer to our clients. And Gold Power is a product, it's also an international REC product. It has been developed by our subsidiary Climate Friendly in Australia. And the interesting thing about Gold Power is that all power plants which are eligible to generate Gold Power have been certified by the Gold Standard Foundation as fully additional and having also additional co-benefits, so economic and social benefits for the local communities. Now the other two regional REC schemes, the North American and the European, as I said, these are the most established ones. So in North America, there are 9 different e-grids and registries, so electronic tracking systems, some of which are interconnected with each other, and hence these US RECs can be moved across the different registries. And some of them are also used for compliance systems in some states in the United States. And while if you are a voluntary buyer of US RECs, you would typically use the Greenie energy label on top of the US REC. The Greenie is a nonprofit organization which basically checks that RECs have not been, the same REC has not been used for compliance and for voluntary reasons, and also includes additional environmental criteria and technical criteria on the US RECs, which have obtained on the power plants which have obtained the Greenie RECs. The European Guarantees of Origin is also a scheme that has existed for quite some time. It has been established by actually a piece of regulation, an European directive, and which obliges all power plants in Europe to get a proof of origin, basically to issue a guarantee of origin that shows from what source that electricity which was inputted into the grid comes from. Now in Europe there is also an interesting development, and that is the availability of additional what we call eco-labels. These are basically labels issued on top of the guarantees of origin, which certify some additional environmental criteria that the power plants which have issued these guarantees of origin must meet. So they are natural made basic and star, which is quite famous in Switzerland. OK Power and Titsud are quite famous and quite used in Germany, and Eco Energy label just used all around Europe. Now I'm not going to go into all of the national schemes. They're quite there's quite a lot to say about each of them, and they're quite different among them. Just wanted to let you know that they exist. Now, the following slide is actually a graphical representation of these different types of REC products that I have just talked about. And you can see also the countries in which, for example, the IRECs are currently available, as well as Gold Power. And this is really a list which changes, like I have to update this slide almost every month, or every 3 months, just to keep track of the developments. There are more and more power plants which are being, in more and more countries, which have these schemes available nowadays. So now, in terms of the criteria that you should take into account when you're purchasing renewable energy certificates, I tried to list them here, and they are described in more detail in the fact sheet that you can find as well attached to this presentation. So first of all, definitely the geographic location of the power plant which generates the RECs is very important, especially if you're reporting your greenhouse gas emissions under the greenhouse gas protocol. Then there are certain rules that you have to follow, because the RECs have to come from the same REC market as the one of the reporting entity. So in other words, if you're, for example, you have electricity consumption in the US, then you can source US RECs from any state in the United States. Same thing is valid for Europe. Well, if you have electricity consumption in China, for example, you can source IREX from China or from grid-connected countries to China, or also from the same region. And then the age of the plant is also an important point to consider, because RECs could be issued actually from a power plant that has been operating for 20 or even 30 years already. And obviously these older power plants have already recouped their investment costs, they amortized their investment costs. So this additional revenue from the sale of RECs will not make too much of a difference. It's really something on top. Well, if you are purchasing RECs from a recently built power plant, then you're making a bigger difference. And this actually brings me to the third criterion, additionality. So the issue of additionality is the following. Several RECs markets have been categorized by oversupply historically, which kept actually prices low, and therefore of RECs low, and therefore this gave not much incentive to increase the supply of RECs by building additional new renewable energy capacity. And then therefore the market has also found some new ways to address this problem. And there are different ways of solving it. In fact, this is where the eco-label is actually come into play. So for example, one way is so-called fund model, where when the revenues from the sale of eco-labeled, for example, guarantees of origin, such as eco-energy, for example, a portion of that revenue from the sale of the eco-label will go into a fund, and then this fund will invest in new small-scale renewable electricity installations, often off-grid installations. So that's a way, in other words, to channel funds into new renewable energy capacity. Then the age of the plant, so limitations on the age of the plant, which are capable or eligible to receive an eco-label, are also a way to spur the investment in new capacity. And this is, for example, the model used by Greenie or the two-sued eco-label. And finally, there is the possibility to, and this is the model used by Gold Power, so the possibility to apply the so-called additionality tool. So basically, it's a set of rules, a demonstration at the level of investment decision, and the moment of investment, that that power plant would not have occurred without the possibility, the forward sale of environmental attributes from that plant in the form of RECs or carbon offsets. So, as I said, there are also other criteria that you have to take into account, like vintage year or the timing of the retirement, as well as you could put certain additional criteria on the renewable energy technology. For example, you might not want to purchase RECs from large hydros with dams, as well as consider only RECs from power plants which also offer some additional co-benefits in terms of social, economic, or environmental benefits, things like health improvements, job opportunities, infrastructure development, poverty alleviation, especially in developing countries. So these are all criteria that you may apply on your REC purchases. Now, this is just a couple of slides on examples of renewable energy projects from which we can offer renewable energy certificates. Come from our portfolio. This is a very interesting solar PV installation in Mexico, which is registered under the international REC standard. It's quite a recent plant, came online in 2013. And the interesting thing is also that it's the biggest PV plant in Mexico that has ever been built so far. And another example is a power plant in China, a 12 megawatt biomass to electricity power plant. This is a Gold Power certified power plant. Here you cannot, it's quite a packed slide, but actually it quantifies this type of co-benefits that I have been talking about before. Things like actually increased income to the employees of this power plant, as well as the peasants, the local peasants, which have been producing cotton, and the residues of this cotton production were dumped before in the fields, and nowadays are actually used to are burned to create renewable electricity and displace coal-fired power plants elsewhere on the Chinese grid. So it's quite an interesting example of a nice project. So finally, once you have purchased renewable energy certificates, there is the importance of reportability. In other words, you would typically want to report such purchases under several frameworks. And I have mentioned this earlier. So RE100 definitely is one framework which is becoming more and more, I would say, used and popular among the multinational organizations, especially. So by purchasing RECs, guarantees of origin, international RECs, that match your electricity consumption, you can actually reach your RE100 target. You have to follow, bear in mind, the technical criteria, which are published on the RE100.org website. And obviously, we will be happy to help you and navigate this technical criteria. And then the greenhouse gas protocol, as I mentioned before, now under so-called market-based method, companies can purchase renewable energy certificates that meet those quality criteria that I mentioned. It's 8 quality criteria. They're quite technical, actually. But if these renewable energy certificates meet the quality criteria, then these RECs purchases, basically the emissions derived from electricity consumption matched by RECs can be reported as 0 emissions, and effectively you can then reduce your scope 2 emissions. And finally, CDP, which I have already mentioned earlier. A lot of CSR managers are actually interested in getting on the so-called A list, the climate list of the CDP, or the A list is a group of companies that excel in carbon performance and therefore like show their leadership in carbon performance. And to get on the A list, you should obtain the maximum number of scores according to scoring criteria of the CDP. And obviously, one of the important one big chunk of scores gets you from when you reduce your emissions compared to your target. And so basically, purchasing RECs will allow you more easier to get to an A list. Among other things, of course, you have to comply with a lot of other issues as well on the environmental side. So this brings me to the next poll, which concentrates on renewable energy certificates, the topic of my part of the presentation. So Fatu, I give it back to you now.
Thank you, Natalia, for shedding some light on how RECs can be used by companies to lower their carbon footprint. We have yet another set of poll questions for you, but before we proceed, I would like to remind you that you can submit questions through the question panel, which we will address at the end of the presentation. So I would like to encourage you all to please submit your questions. Thank you. Moving on to the next poll question. Which type of RECs are you the most familiar with? And here again, multiple answers are possible. Thank you very much. We move on to the next question, which is, which of the following is the most important to you when purchasing RECs? And here you can select up to 3 options. Now let's take a look at the results for this poll. They're quite interesting. Overwhelming majority of you found price to be the most important criteria at 83%, followed by location and alignment with strategic business objectives and reportability. Junio, would you like to comment on these results?
Thank you, Fatou. Well, they're very much in line with yesterday's results, and there is definitely a trend in this sense, which is pretty obvious. Actually, even in the case corporates that are already familiar with low quality RECs, like certificate of origins from all plants, would probably already be familiar with the fact that price is very much not an issue when it comes to this sort of certificates. However, they would probably also be surprised by some of the pricing that some of the higher quality RECs that Natalia has described earlier, like IREX and Gold Power, have. There is in fact quite a good supply of these products from the market, and depending on the volumes that are purchased and the time frame and the kind of project characteristics that buyers are looking for, I can certainly say that the price wouldn't be an issue. But of course, we would need to have a look at the specifics of that, and we certainly want to make sure that we can address this concern, which is obviously the most important for corporates as they're going through a purchasing exercise.
Thank you for that commentary, Junio. We will now proceed with the remaining 2 poll questions. Which regions are the most interesting for you in terms of sourcing RECs? And here multiple answers are possible. Thank you. And finally, the last poll question. What are the key constraints or issues affecting your renewable energy sourcing strategy? And here, please select up to 3 options. I'll now close the poll. Once again, thank you all for participating in these polls. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we will summarize these in a key article that we will share with you within the next few days. So thank you for that. Now we're on to the next steps. What steps can you take towards sourcing renewable energy? Junio will shed some light on this.
Thank you, Fatou, and thank you very much, Natalia, for the insights on the RECs. So the question is very much, where do we go from here? And going back to the previous metaphor, if renewable energy sourcing is indeed a marathon, you can rely on our expertise every step of the way, from the starting to the finishing line. Whether you're looking to design from scratch or improve an existing renewable energy sourcing strategy, we can assist you in determining what is the best approach for your company and quite simply get it done. Together, we can look into different options depending on your time frame for action, your budget, as it is a very important element that we've seen from the polls, as well as, of course, your overall CSR priorities. If managed properly and with the right guidance, a REC strategy can be successfully implemented in a very short time. And we're here to provide you just with that, proper management and the right guidance. It's important also to point out that we're not, of course, concerned just with short-term objectives and gains, and we actually want to help you put in place a long-term strategy that will consider your business and your energy consumption not just as a point in time today, but as a trajectory for tomorrow that will obviously be influenced by other external factors. This holistic approach comes in the form of a wide array of products, services, and labels specifically designed by the South Pole Group for the ICT industry, which you see summarized very well in this slide. We understand as sustainability expert that communication is an essential part of your strategy, and we want to make sure that you can get recognition for your climate action, both within your internal stakeholders as well as externally with investors, clients, and competitors. I'll leave you with this summary, and let me give you an opportunity to recap some of the most important takeaways from this session. As far as the global diplomatic community is concerned, the advent of a low-carbon future is not only auspicable but inevitable. If this is not irrelevant information enough for you, think of the fact that your industry leaders are already leading in this area with very significant and diversified investments in the field of renewable energies. Now, whether it is RECs or PPAs or a combination of both, the flock of the ICT industry is moving fastly and surely towards a clean energy future. Companies that are left behind need to start thinking soon about how to catch up with the rest. A sound, solid, sustainable REC sourcing strategy is an excellent and relatively easy first step to demonstrate your commitments and to let your stakeholders know that you're keeping up with them. PPAs and direct investments are also opportunities that we would love to discuss with you in case you're already part of those corporates that are ahead of the curve in terms of renewable energy strategy. It is now question time, and I look forward to your feedback and comments. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Junio, for that brilliant summary. It is indeed question time. We have received a few questions already, but we would still like to encourage you to submit your questions. The first one, which I will direct to Junio, is what are the CO2 emissions of the ICT sector today? There are several studies and reports on abatement potential in 2020 and 2030, but no statement of current emissions. What do you have to say to that, Junio?
Well, it is true that most of the studies have focused on the abatement potential, and there's also a very good availability of data of information regarding the emissions generated by the sector. Now, one of the challenges is that the companies tend to use very different reporting tools and methodologies, but as it often happens in this sector, the CDP has come to the rescue, and they have actually put together an excellent report on the ICT sector in 2014, so relatively updated, where they've managed to combine all the different reporting tools and come up with a very reasonable estimate for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of the ICT sector, which is just north of 140 million tons of CO2. So that's the, let's say, not just a ballpark figure, but a very good estimate of what the emissions are. And of course, the greatest majority of them, about 100 millions, are Scope 2 emissions, which once again brings back the topic of how relevant and fundamental is energy sourcing from clean energy feedstock.
Thank you, Junio. We will now move on to our next question, which is, what is a correct definition of carbon neutrality? How to communicate carbon abatement and own emissions and possible RECs, for example. Natalia?
Yes, I'm happy to answer this question. So, what's the correct definition of carbon neutrality? Well, actually, at South Pole Group, carbon neutrality is has been for the past our I would say bread and butter. It's our the activity that we have been mostly involved in the past 10 years was actually helping corporations to become carbon neutral. What is very important is that carbon neutrality cannot just be achieved by saying, okay, I calculate my carbon footprint and I just purchase offsets or RECs to compensate for this carbon footprint, hence I'm carbon neutral. No, it's actually a journey which comes with the evaluation of the internal emission reduction opportunities within the company. So setting up also targets to reduce emissions internally, and only then compensate for the remaining emissions which could not be avoided internally. So, and eventually, of course, a company cannot neutralize internally all its emissions, because it means it would not produce anything, it will not operate. You still need to, you have to have a footprint in order to exist. So these unavoidable emissions are the ones that we typically advise companies to compensate for. And then how can you compensate for these emissions? So first, again, you will need to make a distinction between Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So Scope 1 is direct emissions from direct operations. Or, for example, if you're an office-based corporation, a direct emission will be, for example, a natural gas burner for heating inside your building. But if you are obviously a manufacturing company, then you will have a very high direct emissions stemming directly from your factories. Then Scope 2 emissions, as we already discussed, are the ones they are indirect emissions from the purchase of electricity and heat from third parties. And then Scope 3 are either upstream emissions, so emissions of your suppliers, or downstream emissions, so emissions of companies who basically purchase your products. So, for example, the whole life cycle of products, as well as indirect emissions such as employees, transportation, so commuting to work, and flights. Often flights are a very big chunk of corporations' emissions. Now, to compensate these different groups of emissions, typically you can use offsets for all three scopes, 1, 2, and 3, so carbon credits, while renewable energy certificates can only be used to match the Scope 2 emissions, not Scope 1 and Scope 3. So the difference in reporting is such that you would still, even if you buy offsets, you still need to report your emissions under Scope 1 and 3. And if you buy RECs, you can actually report emissions 0 under Scope 2. So eventually, RECs are kind of appearing in in the reporting exercise as an internal reduction. So communicating carbon neutrality is absolutely key. So you don't want to be obviously blamed for greenwashing, and that's why at the start of this answer, you need to have this entire carbon management system in place. Measure, reduce at home as much as you can, compensate for what cannot be reduced.
Thank you for that thorough answer, Natalia. We have now reached the end of the Q&A session. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go through any more questions, but would like to thank you for those of you who have submitted your questions. And I'd also like to highlight the fact that we have attached a fact sheet about renewable energy certificates and the SAP case study, and also today's presentation. It's in a section called handouts in the panel, so please take some time to download these documents. In addition, we would like to receive your feedback on how today's webinar went. So tomorrow you will receive a link where you can answer a few questions that we have provided. And this is quite important for us to be able to improve future webinars. So please take some time to fill out the questions in this survey. And again, I'd like to remind you to keep the conversation going on Twitter using the hashtags Ready42020 and Green ICT, and also tagging South Pole Group. Junio and Natalia would love to hear from you, of course. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to either of them by emailing or even calling directly. They would love to hear more about your renewable energy commitments and how we can support you in the sourcing process. And finally, thank you all for joining us today. We would like to also thank you for your patience. We had some technical difficulties, but we managed to get through to the end. And we hope that you've gained some clarity on how sourcing renewable energy can be a business opportunity for your company. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you again at future events.